What lies at the heart of human motivation? Is it pleasure, as the hedonists believed, survival, as Darwin proposed, or something deeper, something more dynamic, more volatile? For Nietzsche, the answer was neither comfort nor safety, but power. Not power in the political or material sense, but the will to power, a fundamental force that animates all life, expressing itself through growth, expansion, overcoming, and self-assertion. To Nietzsche, this will is not a choice, it is an impulse more primal than reason or morality. It drives not just conquest or ambition, but art, philosophy, love, and even suffering. The will to power is the engine of becoming, the drive not merely to exist, but to excel, to shape, to surpass. Yet Nietzsche's idea is easily misunderstood. It is not about domination over others. It is about mastery over the self. It is not the will to control, but the will to become. And it asks a difficult question. If this is what truly moves us, what does it say about our values, our culture, and our idea of virtue? In an age obsessed with comfort, security, and conformity, Nietzsche's challenge still stands. What really drives us, and what should? Beyond survival, why pleasure and safety aren't enough. Modern psychology often traces human motivation to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Evolutionary theory refines this further. Organisms, including humans, act to preserve themselves, to survive, to replicate. But Nietzsche found these explanations inadequate. They may describe the surface of behavior, but they miss the depth of why we live. Survival, Nietzsche argued, is not life's goal. It is its condition. Merely preserving oneself is not a sign of strength, it is the bare minimum. True vitality is not expressed in caution, comfort, or contentment, but in the will to expand, to create, to overcome. Life, in its highest form, does not cling to safety. It risks. It dares. Nietzsche criticizes the last man, the symbol of a culture addicted to comfort, afraid of suffering, and unwilling to strive. This kind of life may be stable, but it is flat. It may be secure, but it is spiritually small. Against this, Nietzsche sets the will to power, not as greed or cruelty, but as the inward force that drives beings to exceed themselves. Pleasure, too, is seen not as an end, but as a byproduct of overcoming. Joy is not found in sedation or ease. It erupts when the self meets resistance and triumphs. Greatness, for Nietzsche, does not emerge from pleasure. It uses pleasure, but aims at something higher, self-transcendence. To live only for survival or comfort is, in Nietzsche's eyes, to live timidly. The deeper force, what really drives us, is not a desire to feel good, but a hunger to become more. The will to power is this hunger, this striving, this impulse, not just to be, but to become. Defining the will to power, more than domination. The phrase will to power often conjures images of tyranny, conquest, or unchecked ambition, but Nietzsche's concept is far more subtle and far more profound. The will to power is not the lust to rule over others. It is the inner force that drives all life to express, shape, overcome, and create. And thus spoke Zarathustra in his posthumous notes. Nietzsche describes the will to power as the most fundamental force of existence. It is not a desire, it is a condition of being. Everything that lives, Nietzsche says, expresses this will, not merely to maintain itself, but to grow, to impose form, to exert influence. Even a tree stretching toward the light is exercising its will to power. Crucially, Nietzsche does not reduce this force to egoism. The will to power can manifest in acts of generosity, in aesthetic creation, in philosophical rigor. It is not limited to domination over others. It includes mastery over oneself, transformation of one's suffering, and the ability to create values in a chaotic world. What makes this idea radical is that Nietzsche replaces traditional metaphysical drives, God, reason, morality, with something dynamic, fluid, and often irrational. The will to power is not guided by morality, rather, it creates morality. It is not a servant of truth, it interprets truth through its own lens. Nietzsche does not give us a system, he gives us a force, a lens through which to read life, not as a static thing to be preserved, but as a process of continual becoming. Where others see passivity, Nietzsche sees struggle. Where others see contentment, he sees constraint. The will to power is not a theory, it is life itself, viewed from its core impulse. The drive to express, to create, to be more. Becoming, not being. Life as self. Overcoming, become who you are, Nietzsche once wrote. Not as a contradiction, but as a command. At the heart of Nietzsche's thought lies a radical rejection of being as a final state. For Nietzsche, life is not about arriving, it is about becoming, and the will to power is the force that fuels this transformation. To be alive, in Nietzsche's view, is to be unfinished. The self is not a fixed identity, it is a battlefield, a project, a site of constant tension and potential. The noble soul is not the one who guards its essence, but the one who reshapes it. Every struggle, every crisis, every sorrow becomes an opportunity, not for return, but for reinvention. Nietzsche despised stagnation. Whether in dogma, culture, or the self, he saw fixed states as signs of decay. To be static is to resist the will to power. To overcome is to affirm it. Thus, self-overcoming becomes the moral imperative of Nietzsche's worldview, not through guilt or duty, but through an aesthetic and existential striving. This is why Nietzsche valued suffering, not as virtue but as raw material. Pain reveals the limits of the self, and in revealing them, offers the chance to break them. The strongest person is not the one who avoids suffering, but the one who transfigures it into strength. In Nietzsche's cosmos, there are no final forms, only intensities, energies, and transformations. The human being is not a goal, it is a bridge between what we are and what we could become, if we dared to live without guarantees. To live, then, is not to rest in identity, but to push against it. The will to power does not whisper, "Stay safe." It roars, "Go further." The artist, the warrior, the philosopher. Will to power in action. Nietzsche's will to power is not merely an abstract concept. It is a force, visible in the highest forms of human expression. He identifies three archetypes that embody this force in its most creative and vital forms: the artist, the warrior, and the philosopher. The artist does not replicate the world, he reshapes it. Art is the triumph of form over chaos, of vision over formlessness. The artistic impulse is not passive reflection, it is active interpretation. The artist imposes beauty, rhythm, and intensity on life's raw material. This is will to power, not domination, but creation. The warrior too expresses this will, not necessarily in violence, but in discipline, courage, and confrontation. For Nietzsche, the warrior is not a brute, but someone who affirms struggle as the path to excellence. He does not flee hardship, he seeks it to test and strengthen himself. In battle, literal or metaphorical, the warrior transcends comfort and becomes more than himself. And then there is the philosopher, not the abstract academic, but the existential thinker who dares to question all foundations. True philosophy, for Nietzsche, is not about knowledge, it is about value creation. The philosopher must destroy old idols, dismantle inherited systems, and offer new visions. This, too, is a form of will to power, the courage to think dangerously and to live what one thinks. What unites these figures is their affirmative posture toward life. They do not retreat into safety. They do not ask what is true, so much as what can be created. Each, in their own way, embodies power, not over others, but over themselves, their work, their destiny. In these forms, Nietzsche shows us that power need not oppress. At its highest, it builds. It makes art, carves meaning, and reshapes what it means to be human, the psychology of strength, resentment versus vitality. For Nietzsche, not all strength is visible and not all weakness is obvious. The true test of strength lies not in dominance, but in attitude, in the difference between affirmation and resentment. At the heart of Nietzsche's moral psychology is this split: those who say yes to life and those who say no from the shadows. Vitality, in Nietzsche's view, affirms. It creates values rather than inherits them. It turns suffering into energy, contradiction into style. The vital soul is not untouched by pain, but it refuses to be broken by it. It transforms wounds into wisdom. It seeks intensity, not comfort. This is not naive optimism, but radical courage. By contrast, resentment, a deep psychological resentment, arises from weakness. It is the revenge of those who feel powerless. Lacking the strength to act creatively, they devalue what they cannot reach. They call strength evil, success arrogance, pleasure sin. They invent moral systems to chain what they envy. This inversion of values, Nietzsche argues, defines much of traditional morality. What appears as virtue, humility, meekness, obedience, may be symptoms of resentment masquerading as ethics. The good man may not be noble, but compliant, and the bad man may simply be unbroken. The will to power reveals this game. It asks, are you affirming life, or just seeking to control it through guilt? Are your values born from fullness or from fear? Nietzsche's psychology is uncomfortable because it questions our deepest motives, but it also offers liberation. To live from vitality is to shed bitterness. It is to face the world as it is and still say yes. True strength, Nietzsche teaches, is not in overpowering others. It is in becoming someone who does not need to. The masks of morality, when power hides behind virtue. Nietzsche did not merely question morality, he unmasked it. Behind many of our cherished moral ideals, he saw something more unsettling. Not virtue, but a disguised will to power. Not moral truth, but strategies of control. Morality, for Nietzsche, often conceals weakness. Those who lack power, in body, mind, or will, cannot conquer directly, but they redefine conquest as evil. They label strength as arrogance, instinct as sin, confidence as pride. They call their inability to act humility, and their resentment justice. This is not morality born from fullness, but from fear. This kind of moral framework does not seek to elevate, it seeks to tame. It teaches people not how to flourish, but how to obey. It creates guilt where there should be vitality. It protects the status quo by moralizing against those who threaten it, whether through intellect, creativity, or power. Nietzsche's critique is not that all morality is false, but that it often wears a mask. It presents itself as universal, objective, sacred, when it is in fact historical, contingent, and deeply psychological. It reflects the will to power, not of the strong, but of the weak. Those who gain influence not by rising, but by lowering others. This insight forces a difficult question. When we call something good, do we mean it is life-enhancing or merely socially acceptable? Do our values express our strength or hide our fear? Nietzsche does not reject morality. He demands that we examine it. He wants a morality of affirmation, not resentment, of creation, not conformity. True virtue, in his eyes, is not a mask. It is a force that creates rather than controls, and to live morally, then, is not to obey, it is to see clearly and choose courageously. Weakness as strategy, slave morality, and the inversion of values On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche makes a provocative claim. What we commonly call morality is not a product of noble insight, but of social inversion. It is the revenge of the weak, clothed in virtue. He calls this slave morality, a system developed by those who felt powerless in the face of nobility, strength, and self-assurance. Lacking the means to express their will outwardly, they turned inward, repressing their instincts, fearing their desires, and preaching obedience as virtue. Instead of saying, "I am strong," they say, "He is evil." The good becomes not the powerful, but the harmless. In this inversion, power is demonized and weakness is moralized. The lion becomes the sinner, the lamb becomes the saint. Slave morality does not create values. It reacts to power by negating it. It casts a suspicious eye on joy, confidence, sexuality, and ambition, framing them as selfish or sinful. But this strategy, Nietzsche argues, is not born from truth. It is a survival tactic. It enables the weak to avoid confrontation by moralizing the battlefield. It teaches resignation as nobility and submission as enlightenment. Nietzsche contrasts this with master morality, the morality of those who affirm life, create values, and live without apology. It does not seek to rule others, it seeks to express itself fully. The danger of slave morality is not just in its repression, but in its success. When a reactive morality dominates culture, creativity withers, excellence is suspect, the will to power is stifled. Nietzsche's call is not for cruelty, but for truthfulness. He challenges us to see where our values come from and whether they empower us or merely pacify it. Real morality, he believes, cannot come from weakness. It must rise from strength, power, and suffering. Why pain can be transformative. For Nietzsche, suffering is not a detour from life. It is the condition through which life deepens, sharpens, and becomes profound. The will to power is not the will to avoid pain, but the ability to transform it. True power, Nietzsche says, is measured by how much truth and suffering a soul can endure and still affirm life. This idea runs counter to most modern instincts. We see suffering as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to happiness. But Nietzsche saw it differently, as a crucible. Those who suffer without being broken, who create from their suffering, are the ones who embody the highest strength. They turn wounds into wisdom, failure into form. Nietzsche himself knew pain intimately. His physical ailments, exile from academia, and emotional isolation became the ground from which his most profound works emerged. He did not glorify suffering as such, but he glorified the response to it, the ability to say yes even in the face of agony, to live despite. Pain, in this view, is not noble in itself, but what it demands from us can be. It strips us of illusions, tests our resilience, and reveals what we are made of. In suffering, the shallow self dissolves, and something harder, stranger, and stronger may take shape. The will to power does not escape suffering. It uses it. It faces the void and says, "This too is mine." And in doing so, it rises above victimhood and becomes creative force. Nietzsche's challenge is not to embrace suffering masochistically, but to meet it courageously. Not to avoid it, but to metabolize it into growth. Because the deepest power is not in avoiding pain, but in becoming more than it. Creating values, the highest expression of power. Nietzsche's ultimate vision of the will to power is not conquest. It is the highest form of strength is not in subjugating others, but in the dangerous, divine task of creating values where none exist. In a post-religious world where God is dead, Nietzsche warns of nihilism, the collapse of inherited meaning. But he does not mourn this death. He sees it as a necessary clearing, a chance to begin again. When the old values die, the ground becomes fertile for something new. But who will create these new values? Not the crowd, not the herd. Nietzsche's answer is the Übermensch, the Overman, the one who lives beyond good and evil, forging ethics from within. This figure does not imitate or conform. He invents. His values are born not of resentment or fear, but of affirmation, of life, of risk, of becoming. To create values is to take on the godlike burden of defining meaning, not by decree, but by embodying it. The philosopher who thinks radically, the artist who disrupts tradition, the scientist who breaks paradigms, all are expressions of this will. But it is also a lonely path. The creator walks without guarantees. There are no final answers, no external rewards, only the inner necessity to shape the world, to live as a work of art, to act as though meaning can be made. This is power in its most spiritual form, not the ability to command, but to give form to chaos, not to follow values, but to become them. In a world where truths crumble, Nietzsche offers a daring alternative. Do not search for meaning, become the one who creates it, the dance of chaos. Freedom, risk, and the courage to become, Nietzsche once said. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. At the end of all doubt, destruction, and unmasking, what remains is not despair, but freedom. not a retreat into certainty, but a leap into creativity. The strong do not conquer chaos, they move with it. Nietzsche's final gift is not a doctrine, but a challenge. Can you live without guarantees? Can you become the artist of your own existence? In the end, the will to power is not about winning, it is about becoming something bold, strange, vital. Something that dances with chaos rather than flees from it, because only in the chaos can the star be born.